Okay, welcome back to another episode of the Shadows and Ink podcast. And today, our guest is best-selling author J.D. Barker, who's here to answer questions about the creative business magic of co-authoring. So I'm going to let him introduce himself now. So take it away.
Hey, I'm JD Barker, New York Times bestseller. I actually just did a tally the other day. I thought I had 12 books out there. I checked my Wikipedia page. I actually have 19. So it's been a crazy wild ride. I've been a full-time author for about a little over 10 years now.
Yeah, I've lost track of my books too, so I totally get that. So, tell us a little bit about your co-authoring history.
So I actually, when I was coming up in the world, I loved to read, I loved to write, but my parents always told me, writing is a fantastic hobby. You can't make a living at it. You have to get a real job. So I kind of did that. I went off to college. I got multiple degrees, and I ended up working in finance. I was a chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm. That was the last real job that I had. But I always loved to write, and I would come home and I would write at night. And initially, that started off working as a book doctor and a ghostwriter. Years back, I worked for RCA Records, and I used to interview a lot of celebrities. I would interview those, turn those interviews over to magazines like 17 and Teen People and Tiger Beat and stuff like that. And when you work in that world, you quickly realize everybody you're working with has a novel at some stage of development. It's in a desk drawer somewhere. It's 400,000 words long. They've been working on it for 10 years. It's almost done, but it needs a little something. I kind of became the guy they would show those to. So I would help them with, grammatical issues, but more importantly, developmental stuff, and help them get that novel over to the finish line. And that just turned into this little side hustle as a book doctor and a ghostwriter. I did that for 23 years, basically at night while I was working in the corporate world during the daytime. So I spent the bulk of my publishing career working with other people, not necessarily always as a co-author. I wrote a lot of memoirs for other people. I rewrote books for people as a ghostwriter, a lot of different things, but I primarily worked with others. But over that time, the 23 years, I had six different books that hit the New York Times list. They all came out with other people's names on the cover, which gets very old after a while. So I finally decided to write something on my own, and that was really the first time I actually did a book, totally by myself.
Yeah, I know a couple of other ghostwriters too. It's a different process, definitely. Uh, you have to really get used to not having your name on the book cover. So,
Yeah.
yeah, tell us a little about your process when you are co-authoring. I know collaboration systems can vary between authors, so.
Yeah, it depends on the project. Like one of the very first ones that I did, it was a memoir for a football player, and there's NDA, so I'm not allowed to say who it was. But I was at a Miami Dolphin game, very famous player, and I was down on the field, and I walked up to him and we were just talking, and I asked him if he had ever considered writing a book about his life. And he said it comes up all the time, but he's not a writer. He doesn't have the time to do it. So we just, over a couple of weeks, we had a few conversations, and we decided to let his agent, feel that out and see if there was an interest in it. He ended up getting a substantial advance for that book, and I basically wrote it for him, and we split the advance money. So that was how I first broke into writing memoirs for other people. But it's a very weird situation because you interview somebody, or this is how I did it. I would interview them, and I would take those interviews and transcribe them, and then I would have to write that out into a book, in first person in their voice, which is very different, I think, from writing fiction. But it helped me in a lot of ways. I mean, in today's world in writing fiction, I think it's helped me with character development. It's being in the heads of so many other, like real people. I've written memoirs for politicians, for sports figures, for actors, for actresses. So like I basically was them, for 400 pages. And that skill set, I think, is translated.
Yeah, I can see that you sort of getting a in-depth psychological look at different people's lives. It's
Yeah, I mean, if I spend, 3 months pretending to be a psychologist because that's what, who the memoir is for, it's easy enough to take that and turn it into a fictional account in something else.
okay. So what other benefits are there for co-authoring?
I'd like to, I've worked with a lot of different people. So I wrote a prequel to Dracula with Bram Stoker's family, and with that one, I worked with Dacre Stoker, who's Bram's great grandnephew. I also write a lot of books with James Patterson. We're on book six together at this point. Every time I sit down with a co-author, I basically try to figure out where everybody's strengths and weaknesses lie. Yeah, it's almost like having two cooks in the kitchen that are making breakfast. If you both try to make eggs at the same time, it's a problem. But if you divide and conquer, one person makes eggs and the other one makes bacon, everything kind of works out. So it's important to figure out, what everybody is good at the very beginning, and just double down on that. For a lot of the stuff that I've worked on, particularly the nonfiction, people have fascinating lives, but they're not able to document that on paper. Half the time the stories they think are interesting aren't the ones that people really want to read. You've got to really grill them in an interview and get them comfortable and get them talking, and that's when you get the real gold, the stuff that really makes it into a book. Working with fiction, I got a taste for that writing with James Patterson. It's a lot of fun having another voice in that writing room. You can brainstorm together, you can come up with stuff together, and most of the time you come up with an idea that's totally unique that neither of you would have been able to do on your own. And I also like to work with people that have skill sets that are different than mine. I wrote a book about 3, 4 months ago with a woman named Christine Daigle, and it's called Heavier the Stones, and she's a neuropsychologist in real life. So she was able to bring that skill set to the writing room. And as an author, I can fake my way through it. I can do enough Google searches and watch enough documentaries and enough Netflix to pretend to be a neuropsychologist. But to actually have the real, authentic voice in that writing room is priceless. You can't beat that.
Yeah, definitely. So what are some of the pitfalls of co-authoring, and what do you think authors should be aware of if they're considering it?
I think a lot of people approach it as, this is going to save me time because now I only have to write half a book. And that's not necessarily true. I mean, even if you go back and forth, and I've done that where I write one chapter and my co-author writes another chapter and we go back and forth, you still both have to go through all the text. Most of the time, you have to pick one voice or the other. So somebody kind of has to take lead. And whoever has that lead voice has to go through and edit the other person's text in order to fit their voice. There's a substantial amount of work in it. And a lot of times you may have different opinions of where a story should go versus your co-author. That can cause you to have a couple of arguments and butt heads a little bit. So you really need to work with somebody, that is open to co-authoring as much as you are. In today's world, I do it, primarily as a mentoring opportunity. I used to mentor a lot of authors, and I love doing it because it helped me recharge my batteries. But I found that I didn't like charging people for a service. Like it didn't feel right to me. I had to do that because it was a good gatekeeper, but it just didn't feel like the right thing to do. So what I've been doing lately is I find authors that I feel have a talent. They have what I call the writer gene. I think you can teach grammar, punctuation, all the mechanics of writing to just about anybody, but only certain people have the ability to actually tell a story. And I think that shines in certain people. And sometimes you find somebody who is very good at it, but they're still making mistakes. They've got maybe 80% of it dialed in, and there's 20% where they're kind of floundering. A lot of times they're independently publishing, so they're not working with editors or agents. Nobody's telling them what they're doing wrong. They're just putting these books out, and the same problem repeats over and over and over again. So I look for people that have that particular issue, somebody that I can help. And then I guide them through the entire writing process from start to finish. I teach them how to craft, primarily thrillers at this point. But I teach them how to craft a solid book from A to Z and work out those particular problems that they have. So the next time when they sit down to write a book on their own, those issues have been resolved and they're that much better for it.
So do you have any advice for authors that are establishing a collaborative writing process, advice on note taking, world building, that sort of thing?
Again, it's just all about dividing and conquering. To give you an example, so when I wrote the prequel to Dracula, I worked with Dacre Stoker. But in real life, he was a history teacher and he was a tennis pro. So from a writing standpoint, he could write nonfiction all day long, and he could be extremely detailed and extremely accurate. But it was dry, and everything that he wrote read like a textbook. And we knew that going in. I was coming at the project, as a fiction author. And we knew we needed to find something somewhere in the middle. So when we wrote that particular book, I did the bulk of the writing, but he was there for the details. So one point, if I needed to know what Bram Stoker's bedroom looked like when he was 6 years old, Dacre was able to tell me right down to the pieces of furniture and where they were in the room. And that adds again authenticity.
Yeah, so he was sort of like your personal research guy.
He was, but in a lot of ways that's where it works. And again, I've had other projects where I've gone back and forth. I'm the only guy who's ever gotten James Patterson to pants a novel. I'm guessing your audience knows the difference, pantsing versus plotting. He's a notorious plotter. He comes up with 30 to 40 pages of an outline before he starts to write a book. But he knew that when we first met that I was a pantser. So we initially didn't think we'd be able to work together because the styles were so different. But he was willing to take a shot and try something, that he had never done before. So we literally wrote a book where I would write a chapter, paint him into some kind of impossible corner, send it off to him, and thinking he's not going to get out of this. And then 10 minutes later, he'd send me a new chapter back, and not only did he get out of it, but he put me in an even crazier position. And we had a lot of fun with it. We went back and forth like that, and it's probably today is still the twistiest novel I've ever worked on. Mainly because we were both willing to go outside of our comfort zone a little bit and try something a little bit different.
Yeah, I guess you like the challenge.
Yeah, when you write that many books, the challenge is what keeps you motivated, keeps it fun.
Mhm. So, what should co-authors decide on before they begin the project? Should you have a full business plan before writing?
If you're doing a nonfiction book, I think you need a business plan. If it's going to just be a fiction novel, I think you just have to nail down the basics. Who's going to create the characters? Are you going to do that together? Who's going to, build the world? Are you going to do that together? Is one person going to write dialogue and another one is going to write something else? Again, figure out what your strengths and weaknesses are, and double down on those. And you have to be honest with yourself. If you're an author, are you good at writing dialogue? If you're not, is the person sitting next to you better at it? If that's the case, then maybe they should write the dialogue, or at the very least tweak the dialogue. You take a first stab at it, they go back through and they write the other half. Sometimes it makes sense for the two people or three people, everybody working on the book, to write different characters. You take these characters, I take these characters, and then that gives those characters different voices. But it's a discussion I think that needs to happen at the very beginning. You need to figure out all of those things before you really start writing, because otherwise you get a couple of chapters in, things just aren't working. You're not quite sure why. You're butting heads. Like you need to have everything ironed out, I think, before you start the writing process.
Yeah, I can see that. I can also see that writing different characters would work nicely if you're doing a different point of view novel as well, something like a romance, for instance. So, what are the main business aspects that people should consider when they're co-authoring things like intellectual property, royalty splits, and things like that?
All of those things come into play. I mean, when you co-author a book, it literally lasts longer than some marriages. It's a lifetime commitment. So you have to be willing to, you have to decide how you're going to divide all that up. Is it going to be an equal 50-50 split? Is there some other arrangement? From my standpoint, I'm published in 150 different countries. So it gets tricky. There's so many different publishers involved. The co-author titles that I do as a work for hire. So I pay my co-author a flat fee, and then I own 100% of the project when it's done, which just simplifies everything from an accounting standpoint. We agree, like my contracts with Patterson specifically state that my name has to be the same font size as his name on the cover. It seems like a little detail, but very few of his co-authors have ever pushed for that. And, I was lucky enough where he was willing to do it. But if I wouldn't have asked that question, it wouldn't have happened. There's a lot of things like that you have to agree on straight off the bat. Whether it doesn't even matter if you're going to indie publish that or you're going to traditionally publish it. You still have to understand, how you want to handle each of those different things.
Yeah, definitely. So, do you have any advice on handling issues or legal disputes that do come up?
Yes, hire an attorney.
Excellent advice.
I am not an attorney. And you should each have your own attorney. It may seem like it makes sense for you both to use one attorney to hammer out your agreement and things like that, but it really doesn't. I mean, you should have a written agreement with your co-author. It should be drafted by your attorney, their attorney, whoever, and then the other person's attorney should review that. You want to have two different voices weighing in on that, just to make sure everything is fair for all parties.
Okay, so do you have any thoughts on using something like Kickstarter for financing a collaborative project?
I've got a lot of friends that have done well with Kickstarter, and I look at it every time somebody tells me another story. I personally never tried Kickstarter though to raise money for something, mainly because that's just not where my audience is. And I think it's a viable source for just about anybody, but it's a different audience. If in my case, I've got a lot of Kindle Unlimited readers. I've got a lot of people that look for my hardcovers in the bookstore. I've got these different segments. None of them are necessarily from Kickstarter. But if you decide you want to focus on that, I think it's a viable business model. One of the things I love about Kickstarter is they give you the email addresses of everybody that sponsors your campaign. That's a huge way to start a mailing list. To have that and be able to go back to that group over and over again with your next project and the next one after that. It's there's so many different viable paths I think to publishing. Today's world. You've got traditional markets, you've got indie stuff, you've got people that are selling direct, on their own websites, other ones that are selling through Shopify. Then there's Kickstarter, and there's audiobooks, there's all these different things that you can do. A lot of it really comes down to time. How much time do you have, and how much are you willing to dedicate to to doing each of these things? The more that you can do, the better.
Yeah, yeah, diversifying is good for an author these days. So you touched a little bit on this, but how do you handle research with a co-author?
I mean, for the most part, we both kind of do our own, depending on who's writing what section. If it's one of my co-authors, typically I'm teaching them how to write a book, so I kind of walk them through. I'll point them in the right direction on how to research something, but I don't necessarily do the work for them. I want them to understand how to do it. I've got contacts at this point for a lot of different things. If I need to write something regarding, related to the FBI, I've got contacts with the FBI. I can run stuff by. That's great for keeping things accurate. All the alphabet agencies with the U.S. government have those people that you can reach out to. Yeah, I think everybody needs to do the research. I think it's important that you research whatever section you're actually writing, because if your partner researches it for you, I don't think it's not going to come out quite as well.
Yeah, you do have to know the fundamentals, even if you don't use it in the book. I do a lot of historical writing, so I know a lot of things that never go into the book, but you need to know it.
Yeah.
So, how is marketing when you've done a book with a co-author? Is it easier than marketing a solo book?
I think if you each have your own audience, it's helpful, because you can go out to those different groups. I run into unique problems. I've got a lot of solo titles that are out there, but like if I drop a book with James Patterson, Hachette, which is his publishing company, Little Brown, they're going to run Facebook ads. And I always notice a month or two before, a co-author title with Patterson comes out, all of a sudden Facebook ads for my name, for JD Barker, get very expensive, because I'm basically bidding against Hachette for ads for my own name. So I think you have to consider things like that. If you've got two authors and you each have your own mailing list, your own Facebook groups, your own this, your own that, you can scattershot both of those, and basically double the amount of people that are looking at that book. I think you can use the co-author title as a means to expand your own audience, by basically introducing new people from the other your co-author's side to your own work.
Yeah, that's a little bit like group promos and things like that as well, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all similar.
So, what should authors consider when dissolving a co-author partnership, especially if they're doing something like, say, in a shared world?
Well, I think that's something that needs to be decided at the beginning, and it should be part of that written agreement that you both, sign at the start of the project. Because the last thing you want to do is get, five, six, seven books in and decide you don't want to work with this person anymore. Because then, everything could be in limbo. And if you haven't figured that out, it is almost like a divorce. You may both, have very differing opinions on how you want to break that up and how you want to continue it. That can become a hostile situation. So I think it's best to work it all out at the very beginning, get it down to writing, get it down on paper, when everybody's friendly, to make sure you understand how that's going to happen. Because every one of these partnerships, they do dissolve, they do end at some point or another, whether it's friendly or not. But it's important to isolate exactly how that ending is going to take place.
Yeah, because I mean, especially if you're writing a series, the series is going to end at some point, probably.
It,
Although some
it might,
series
or
do
or
tend to
maybe
go on.
you decide it's going to end, and your co-author decides that it shouldn't end, and then all of a sudden you're trying to figure out, you're navigating those waters.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, though. Should something like that go into a contract if someone wants to continue a series without the other author?
Yeah, I think all of that needs to be spelled out. And what does that look like? Because let's say you're seven books in, you own a portion of that IP, that intellectual property. Your co-author is continuing it, and you're not, which means they're doing all the work. But you do still own that IP, which means you should technically be compensated, even though you're not writing these future books. All these things need to be thought out ahead of time.
Yeah, definitely. So, what do you enjoy most about co-authoring?
I just enjoy working with other people. When I work with somebody else, we end up creating a book, or I look at it as a product, that neither of us could have created on our own. I may have a particular idea for how a book should end. My co-author may have a different one, and when we start talking that out, we end up coming up with option three, which is totally different from something either of us would have written. And that's what makes it fun.
Yeah. Do you have a different mindset when you go into co-authoring as, say, doing a solo book?
I don't know if it's a different mindset. I try to keep an open mind no matter what I'm working on. But I do try to, listen to my co-authors as much as possible, and their opinions are just as valid as my own. I think a lot of authors, we're solo people, right? We're introverts, so it's difficult to work with other people. So you have to be geared towards doing that to begin with. But even if you write a solo book, in the end, if you take the traditional route, you're working with an agent, you're working with editors, you're working with marketing people. All of those people have a voice in that final book. I had a book that I was writing with Patterson called The Noise, and a film studio picked it up before we even finished it. We were sending them chapters of the book as we were writing. So not only did we have to satisfy each other, but we had directors and we had a writing room on the other side that were reading all of those pages, and they were looking at things like budgeting and filming locations and this and that. Like, asking us to change the pages based on those parameters, which have nothing to do with the story. But it's a potential for a TV show, so you do those things. So I think you have to take a step back and realize you're not necessarily creating a piece of art anymore. You're creating a product that's ultimately going to be sold by other people. So you need to try and keep everybody happy.
Yeah, there's always the negotiation part of it's always tricky. So, you also have a new book that recently came out. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
The latest one is called Something I Keep Upstairs. It's actually sitting right behind me. It released in May. The tagline for the book is called, or is for a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die. It's about a kid. He's 17 years old. His grandmother passes away, and she leaves him a house on an island. It's a house on a private island. So he does exactly what you would figure any 17-year-old would do. He turns it into a party house for him and his friends. Which is obviously fun for a little while, but they get bored with that, and eventually somebody raises their hand and says, "Hey, what would it take to turn this house, perfectly normal house, into a haunted house?" And they start exactly where you would expect. There's a couple of scary stories. There's a Ouija board. But that tagline for the book, for a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die. You know that going in, so you know where they're heading. And a book like this, it's all about the journey. It's a fun story, and the best part about it is the house itself is actually real.
Oh, that's cool. That's always a interesting thing when you've got real locations. It's always helpful with the research too.
Yeah, I mean, for part of the marketing for the book, we actually gave away an overnight stay to one reader in the haunted house on a private island. I think they're going to be out there in August.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd consider that a prize, but I know some people
You'd
would
be
like it.
surprised. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't want to go off into the weeds because we're talking about co-authors, but from a marketing standpoint, one of the things I always try to do is come up with something that's going to get people talking. And when you give away an overnight stay in a haunted house, people talk about that. So like they created tons of word of mouth and advertising for the book that we, basically didn't have to pay for.
Yeah, I have a couple of friends that probably would have loved that, but yeah. So do you have any projects or books on the horizon?
I have 12 books on the horizon. Yeah, right. Yeah, writing with James Patterson, he's kind of gotten me on that co-author bug. So I've got a lot of different people I'm working with, on top of my solo titles and another book that I'm working on with Jim. So I've got a lot of books coming down the road.
Anything you can talk about? Any secrets you can spill, or is it all hush hush?
It's always hush hush until it's out. That's just kind of the way things work.
Yeah, I understand that. Okay, so I think we'll wrap the interview up here. It's a pleasure chatting with you, and we learned quite a bit, I think.
All right. Well,
So,
thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
okay, that's it for this episode of the Shadows and Ink podcast. And join us next month. And bye for now.